Look, sometimes you do things that seem perfectly reasonable in the moment, and then everyone acts like you've committed some massive crime. I'm Sadie. I'm 23. And I need you to understand the full story before you make any judgments about what happened with my boyfriend Logan's apartment situation. Because honestly, the way this all went down was completely unfair to me. And I'm still processing how everything got so twisted around. So Logan and I had been dating for 6 months when this whole mess started. He's 26, has his own place. Nothing fancy, just a regular apartment. But it was his... I was stuck living with my mom, which was basically hell on earth. She's got serious issues, addiction problems, constantly broke. And she has this charming habit of stealing money from me whenever she gets desperate, which is often she'd blame me for everything wrong in her life. Like somehow her problems were my fault just because I existed. The woman couldn't keep a job, couldn't pay bills, but somehow I was the reason her life sucked. Real mature, right? When things got really bad at home, Mom had another one of her episodes and took $40 out of my wallet while I was sleeping. Logan offered to let me stay with him for a while. And look, I wasn't trying to move in permanently or anything. I just needed somewhere stable to figure my shit out. He was sweet about it, said I could stay as long as I needed, that we'd figure it out together. For the first month, everything was actually really good between us. We had our little routines. He'd make coffee in the morning. I'd straighten up the place during the day. It felt normal, like what a real relationship was supposed to feel like. But then work became this absolute nightmare. My boss at the retail place where I worked was one of those people who gets off on making everyone miserable. She'd hover over me, critique every little thing I did, and then have the nerve to schedule me for these random shifts that made it impossible to have any kind of life. The final straw was when she screamed at me in front of customers because I forgot to ask someone if they wanted to sign up for the store credit card. Like, I'm trying to ring up their stuff, and she's losing her mind over some stupid credit card sign up. I looked at her, looked at the customers staring at us like we were putting on some kind of show, and just walked out. I was done with that toxic environment. Logan wasn't exactly thrilled when I told him I quit, but I explained the situation and he seemed to get it. I mean, who wants to stay somewhere they're being treated like garbage? I promised him I'd start looking for something else right away, that this was just temporary, and I meant it. I really did, but job hunting is exhausting, and most places wanted to pay practically nothing anyway. Why bust my ass for minimum wage when I could take a little time to find something actually worth my time? 2 months went by faster than I expected. I'd apply to places here and there, but nothing was really clicking. Logan started getting this tone whenever we talked about money. Not mean exactly, but you could tell he was stressed about covering everything. I felt bad about it, obviously, but it's not like I was sitting around doing nothing. I was trying. Sometimes these things just take time, you know? You can't force the right opportunity to come along. That's when Tyler started reaching out again. My ex from last year. We dated for about 2 months before I realized he was way too clingy and I had to end things. I might have ghosted him, which wasn't my finest moment, but sometimes you have to be direct when guys won't take a hint. Anyway, he started texting me out of nowhere, saying he'd been thinking about me, that he missed talking to me. At first I ignored him, but then he sent this long message about how he'd grown up a lot, how he understood why I left, and how he just wanted to be friends. Honestly, it felt good to have someone reach out who actually seemed to appreciate me. Logan had been so focused on bills and work stress lately that we barely talked about anything else. Tyler remembered little things about me, asked how I was doing, actually listened when I vented about my situation. We started texting more regularly, and then he suggested we grab coffee one afternoon while Logan was at work, just as friends. Catching up, nothing weird about it. The coffee thing turned into a regular thing. Tyler would text me in the mornings. We'd meet up somewhere in the middle of the day, talk for a few hours. Then I'd be back at Logan's before he got home. It wasn't like I was hiding it exactly. I just didn't see the point in making Logan worry about something that was completely innocent. Tyler was different than before. More mature, less desperate. He'd ask about my job search, offered to help me practice for interviews, actually give me useful advice, instead of just telling me everything would work out eventually. And okay, maybe there were some moments where things felt like more than friendship. Tyler would look at me the way Logan used to when we first started dating. Before everything got complicated with money and living situations, sometimes our hands would touch when we reached for our coffee cups at the same time. Or he'd sit a little closer than necessary when showing me something on his phone. But we never crossed any real lines. We were just connecting as people. There's nothing wrong with having a friend who understands you. The thing is, Logan and I never officially had the talk about being exclusive. We were living together, sure, but that was more about my housing situation than some big relationship commitment. I cared about Logan, obviously, but I wasn't ready to close myself off from other possibilities just because we were in a convenient arrangement. Life is complicated. Relationships are complicated. And sometimes you need to keep your options open while you figure out what you really want. Tyler started asking more questions about Logan, how serious we were, whether I was happy, if I saw a real future there. And honestly, I found myself telling him things I couldn't say to Logan, like how frustrated I was that Logan seemed more concerned about money than supporting me through a difficult time, how he'd get this look whenever bills came up, like I was some burden he had to carry. Tyler actually listened without making me feel guilty for having feelings. Maybe I complained about Logan more than I should have. Maybe I told Tyler that living with Logan was temporary, that I was just figuring out my next move. But none of that was technically lying. It was all true from a certain perspective. I was figuring things out. I didn't know what the future held. And if Tyler interpreted that to mean I was available, well, I never explicitly told him I was off limits either. The whole thing was perfectly manageable until Tyler decided to be dramatic and show up at Logan's apartment one night. Logan and I were in bed watching something on his laptop when we heard this aggressive banging on the front door. My stomach immediately dropped because I had this horrible feeling I knew exactly who it was. Logan looked confused but got up to check. And sure enough, there's Tyler standing in the hallway, looking like he'd been crying or something equally pathetic. "Why haven't you been answering my texts?" Tyler asked, trying to look around Logan to see me. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday." Logan turned back to look at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly, but completely bewildered. "Do you know this guy?" Before I could even process what was happening, Tyler started going off about how I was cheating on him, how he couldn't believe I was shacking up with some random guy when we'd been working on getting back together. Logan's face went through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds, while Tyler kept rambling about our coffee dates and how confused he was about where we stood. I jumped out of bed and started screaming at Tyler to leave, calling him crazy, telling Logan that Tyler was just some obsessed ex who couldn't accept that we were over. But Tyler wasn't backing down. He kept talking about specific conversations we'd had, things I told him about Logan, details that made it obvious we'd been spending a lot more time together than I could explain away as coincidental run-ins. Logan finally managed to get Tyler to leave by threatening to call the police. But the damage was completely done. Tyler walked off crying like the dramatic little bitch he's always been. But Logan just stood there, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The questions started immediately. How did Tyler know where Logan lived? How long had we been talking? What did I tell him about our relationship? I went into full damage control mode, explaining that Tyler was delusional, that he was twisting innocent conversations into something they weren't. I told Logan that Tyler had been harassing me for weeks, that I'd been trying to handle it quietly without dragging Logan into the drama. Some of that was even partially true. Tyler had been persistent, and I was trying to manage the situation. But Logan kept asking these specific questions that I couldn't answer properly without revealing more than I wanted to reveal. The worst part was how calm Logan stayed through the whole interrogation. He wasn't yelling or throwing things. He was just sitting there, processing everything with this terrifyingly neutral expression. Every lie I told seemed to make him more distant instead of more convinced. By the time we went to bed that night, I could tell something fundamental had shifted between us, and I had no idea how to fix it. The next morning, Logan left for work without saying much, which wasn't totally unusual, but something felt off. I spent the day trying to figure out how to explain everything in a way that wouldn't make me look terrible. Maybe I could tell him that Tyler had been pressuring me to meet up, that I'd only done it to get him to leave me alone, or that I'd been trying to help Tyler with some personal problems as a friend, and he'd misinterpreted my kindness. I had almost convinced myself that I could spin this into something manageable when Logan came home that evening with a completely different energy. "We need to talk," he said, and pulled out his phone. He'd gotten a message from Tyler on social media, a long, detailed explanation of everything. Our coffee dates, the things I'd said about Logan being just temporary, how I'd complained about him being cheap and boring, how Tyler and I had been rebuilding our connection for months. Tyler had even sent screenshots of some of our text conversations, including ones where I'd called Logan controlling for asking where I was going during the day. I tried to explain that Tyler was manipulating the context of those conversations, that he was making everything sound worse than it was. But there was no getting around some of the specific things I'd said. Like when I texted Tyler that Logan doesn't really get me, or when I told him that living with Logan was just convenient for now. Seeing my own words reflected back at me or through Logan's phone made them sound so much harsher than they'd felt when I'd written them. "Is any of this true?" Logan asked, scrolling through the messages. His voice was still calm, but there was something final about the way he was looking at me. I started crying, explaining that Tyler was twisting everything, that I'd never meant for any of this to happen. I reminded Logan about my impossible situation with my mom, how I'd had nowhere else to go, how grateful I was for everything he'd done for me. I told him Tyler meant nothing to me, that I'd cut him off completely if that's what Logan wanted. I promised I'd get a job immediately, that I'd make everything up to him. But Logan just kept shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore. Sadie, I can't be in a relationship where I don't know what's real." I begged him not to make any rash decisions, that we could work through this if he just gave me a chance. I pointed out how good we were together most of the time, how this was just one stupid mistake that got blown out of proportion. I even offered to show him my phone, to prove that I'd block Tyler everywhere and never speak to him again. "It's not just about Tyler," Logan said. "It's about the lying. It's about you complaining about me to another guy instead of talking to me directly. It's about you keeping secrets while I'm supporting you financially and emotionally. I need you to move out." The words hit me like a physical blow. Move out. Where was I supposed to go? Back to my mom's disaster of a life. I explained that I literally had nowhere else to stay, that he was basically throwing me out on the street over some text messages. I reminded him that I'd never actually cheated, that talking to an ex isn't some unforgivable sin. But Logan had already made up his mind. He gave me until the weekend to figure something out. 3 days to pack up my life and find somewhere else to live, with no money saved and no job lined up. When I pointed out how impossible that timeline was, he just said he was sorry, but he couldn't pretend to trust me anymore. The conversation was over. I spent the next 2 days alternating between rage and panic. How could Logan be so heartless, so willing to throw away 6 months together over some misunderstanding? I called my one close friend, Jenna, but she was dealing with her own relationship drama and couldn't offer more than a couch for maybe one night. I looked into shelters and cheap motels, but everything required money I didn't have. My mom's place was looking like my only real option, which felt like the ultimate defeat. On Friday morning, I came back from a job interview to find all my stuff packed in cardboard boxes by the front door. Logan was at work, but he'd left a note saying he'd changed the locks and I should leave my key on the kitchen counter. He'd packed everything carefully, my clothes folded properly, my toiletries in a separate bag, even my few pieces of jewelry wrapped in tissue paper. Somehow that made it worse than if he'd just thrown everything in garbage bags. The care he'd taken while essentially evicting me felt like the cruelest part of the whole thing. I sat on his front steps for 2 hours, hoping he'd come home and we could have one final conversation. When he finally showed up, he looked surprised to see me still there, but not sympathetic. I tried one last time to explain that Tyler had manipulated the whole situation, that I'd never meant to hurt him, that we could start fresh if he just gave me another chance. "I hope you figure things out, Sadie," he said, and walked past me into the building. That was it. 6 months of my life dismissed in one sentence. I had to call my mom to come pick me up, which was humiliating on about 15 different levels. She showed up 2 hours later in her beat-up car, complaining about gas money and making passive-aggressive comments about how she knew this would happen eventually. The drive back to her apartment was silent except for her occasional sighs and muttered comments about how I never learn. Being back at my mom's place was exactly as horrible as I'd expected. The apartment still smelled like cigarettes and disappointment. Bills were still piling up on every surface. And she still had the same toxic energy that had driven me to Logan's place in the first place. Within a week, she was back to her old patterns, asking to borrow money I didn't have, blaming me for various problems that had nothing to do with me, and making comments about how I'd burned my bridges with Logan. Tyler kept trying to contact me for weeks after everything exploded. He seemed to think that now that Logan was out of the picture, we could pick up where we'd left off. But I was furious with him for ruining everything. If he'd just kept his mouth shut and not shown up at Logan's apartment like some crazy person, none of this would have happened. I blocked him on everything. But he kept finding new ways to reach out. Different social media accounts, email addresses, even showing up at places he knew I might be. It was exactly the kind of obsessive behavior that had made me ghost him in the first place. The job search became even more urgent now that I was back to sharing a tiny apartment with my mom and her chaos. I finally found something at a call center. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid enough for me to start saving for my own place again. The work was mind-numbing, and the customers were mostly awful, but at least it was steady income, and they didn't care that I'd quit my last job without notice. 3 months after Logan kicked me out, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break when I saw that he'd updated his relationship status to single. Not that I was keeping track of his profiles or anything, but we still had mutual friends, and these things show up in the feed sometimes. Seeing it in official Facebook terms somehow made the whole situation feel more final than it had before. A few weeks later, Jenna mentioned that she'd run into Logan at the grocery store, and he'd seemed really good, relaxed, happy, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell she thought he was better off without me. Even my own friend was taking his side in the breakup, which felt like a betrayal on top of everything else I was dealing with. The worst part was hearing through other people that Logan had started seeing someone new just 4 months after our relationship ended. 4 months, like I was so easily replaceable that he could just move on without any processing time or grief about what we'd lost. I heard she was some girl from his work, probably one of those stable, boring types who would never create any drama or complications in his perfectly organized life. It's been 8 months since Logan threw me out of his apartment. And honestly, I'm still processing the whole experience. I'm finally in my own small studio apartment, which isn't much, but it's mine. And I don't have to deal with my mom's dysfunction every day. The call center job turned into something slightly better at a different company. So I'm making decent money now and rebuilding my independence. But I still think Logan completely overreacted to what was essentially a misunderstanding. Yes, I was talking to Tyler, and yes, maybe I said some things about Logan that I shouldn't have said. But I never actually cheated, and I never had any real intention of leaving Logan for Tyler. The whole thing got blown so far out of proportion because Tyler couldn't handle being just friends and had to create drama where none existed. What bothers me most is how quickly Logan gave up on us. 6 months together, and he couldn't even try to work through one rough patch. He just decided I was untrustworthy and threw away everything we'd built together. If he'd really cared about me, he would have been willing to fight for the relationship instead of just cutting me loose the moment things got complicated. I learned a lot about Logan's character through this whole mess. How he handles conflict. How quickly he can turn cold when things don't go his way. How he's not as understanding and supportive as he pretended to be in the beginning. Maybe I dodged a bullet by finding out what kind of person he really was before I wasted even more time on him. The people in my life who know the full story seem to think I'm somehow the bad guy in all of this. But they don't understand the complete picture. They don't know what it was like living with my mom's chaos, or how isolated and unappreciated I felt with Logan toward the end. They don't know how Tyler manipulated the situation to make everything look worse than it was, or how Logan refused to even consider my perspective before making his decision. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly. Obviously, maybe I should have been more upfront about staying in touch with Tyler, or maybe I should have been more careful about what I said in those text messages. But people make mistakes, and real relationships are supposed to survive some bumps in the road. The fact that Logan couldn't handle one complicated situation tells me everything I need to know about what kind of partner he would have been long-term. Now I'm focused on building my own life, my own stability, without depending on anyone else for my housing or financial security. I'm not looking for anything serious relationship-wise right now because I've learned that people can disappoint you when you least expect it. But when I am ready to date again, I'll know better what to look for in a partner. Someone who's actually willing to work through problems instead of just bailing at the first sign of trouble. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Tyler hadn't shown up that night, or if Logan had been more willing to hear my side of the story. But there's no point dwelling on what ifs when I have my own future to figure out. I survived my mom's dysfunction. I survived being essentially homeless for a few months. And I survived Logan's rejection. I'm stronger now than I was before any of this happened. And that's something no one can take away from me. The whole experience taught me that you can't rely on other people to save you from your problems. You have to save yourself, build your own stability, and trust your own judgment about what's best for your life. Maybe that's a harsh lesson, but it's a realistic one. And honestly, I'm better off learning it now rather than later, when there might have been even more at stake.